185,000 soldiers surrounded Jerusalem, ready to destroy it at dawn. And a single man, on his knees in an empty temple, uttered 5 phrases that proved more lethal than all those swords combined. "You alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You made the heavens and the earth." That was it. No army, no allies, no military plan. 5 lines directed at heaven from a temple whose golden doors had been ripped off, and the next morning 185,000 bodies covered the Assyrian camp, all dead, without a single visible wound. The story we're going to walk through today is not about the angel that killed them. It's about what activated that angel. It's about a prayer. And when I say prayer, I don't mean a nice phrase repeated out of habit. I mean a prayer constructed like a legal argument before the court of heaven, where every word was a strategic piece designed to give God a reason to act. There's a Hebrew word inside that prayer that changes everything, and we're going to get to it. But there's also something most people don't know. The man who uttered that prayer had already tried to resolve the crisis on his own, had already paid an enormous ransom, had already failed. The prayer was his last resort, and it turns out it should have been the first. But to understand the weight of every word Hezekiah spoke in the temple, you first need to understand what he was fighting against. Because the prayer wasn't born in a vacuum. It was born as a response to the most sophisticated machine of psychological warfare in the ancient world. And what the Assyrians did to Hezekiah before that night explains why his prayer was so different from any other in the Bible. We're in the year 701 BC. The Assyrian Empire dominated the known world. We're not talking about a strong kingdom. We're talking about the ancient equivalent of a nuclear superpower. Assyria had conquered nation after nation, had deported entire peoples, had razed cities to the ground. 2 Kings chapter 17 verses 5 and 6 describes it with a frightening coldness. The king of Assyria invaded the whole land, went up against Samaria, and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria. Israel, the northern kingdom, 10 tribes, disappeared. Just like that. And now, next on the list was Judah, the small southern kingdom, the last domino. And notice this. The king of Assyria wasn't just any king. He was Sennacherib, a man who had inherited from his father Shalmaneser an already brutal empire and had expanded it to unprecedented levels. Assyrian inscriptions found in the ruins of Nineveh by archaeologists in the 19th century describe his campaigns with a pride that chills the blood. He boasted of having besieged 46 fortified cities of Judah and of having shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage in Jerusalem. Those are his words, carved in stone. A hexagonal clay prism known today as the Taylor Prism, displayed in the British Museum. And the interesting thing is that inscription confirms many details of the biblical account, but conveniently omits what happened next. We'll get to that. Now, on the other side of this equation was Hezekiah, and this is where the contrast becomes almost absurd. 2 Kings chapter 18 verses 3 through 7 tells us that Hezekiah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places, broke the sacred pillars, cut down the Asherah poles, and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, because until those days the children of Israel burned incense to it. Hezekiah put his trust in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, neither before nor after him. Think about it. This man had cleansed the country of idolatry. He had destroyed objects that the people themselves considered sacred, including something Moses himself had crafted centuries earlier, the bronze serpent from Numbers, chapter 21, verses 8 and 9, because the people had begun worshipping it instead of worshipping God. Hezekiah understood something very few kings understood, that even God's tools can become idols if you give them the wrong place. But there's something most people don't know about Hezekiah. His father was Ahaz, one of the worst kings Judah ever had. 2 Kings chapter 16, verses 2 through 4 describes it bluntly. Ahaz did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He walked in the way of the kings of Israel, and even passed his son through the fire, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. Ahaz sacrificed children, his own son, on pagan altars, and that man was Hezekiah's father. Think about it. Hezekiah grew up in a palace where his father practiced the worst of idolatry. He saw firsthand the spiritual destruction of a nation. And when he came to the throne at 25 years old, according to 2 Kings 18, verse 2, he made the radical decision to undo everything his father had built. He didn't inherit the faith. He chose it. And that makes his story even more powerful because it proves that your origin doesn't determine your destiny. And that connects with something that will be important later when we analyze his prayer. Hezekiah's faith wasn't the comfortable faith of someone who grew up in a devout home. It was faith forged in resistance against everything around him. And that kind of faith produces a different kind of prayer. And yet, despite all that faithfulness, he was now surrounded. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers camped around Jerusalem, every one of the 46 fortified cities of Judah taken. The situation was so desperate that Hezekiah himself had tried to buy peace. 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 14 through 16 tells it without embellishment. Hezekiah sent a message to Sennacherib at Lachish saying, "I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I will pay whatever you demand." The king of Assyria imposed on Hezekiah 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah gave him all the silver found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the palace. He even stripped the gold from the doors and doorposts of the temple to hand it over. Stop at that detail for a moment. The gold from the temple doors. This was the temple Solomon had built with unimaginable resources, described in 1 Kings chapter 6 with dizzying detail. And Hezekiah, the king who had cleansed Judah of idolatry, who had restored true worship, was now stripping the gold from that same temple to pay a pagan king. The humiliation was total. 2 Chronicles chapter 29 tells us Hezekiah had dedicated enormous efforts to restoring and purifying that temple at the beginning of his reign, and now he was dismantling it with his own hands. But notice something that reveals Hezekiah's character. Gold can be replaced, doors can be rebuilt, but the lives of his people cannot. He was making a practical calculation, sacrificing the material to save the human. It was an act of desperate humility, and it didn't work because Sennacherib took the gold and came anyway. That's what makes this story so real. It's not the story of a hero who did everything right from the beginning. It's the story of a man who tried to resolve things his way, failed, and only then found the right path. And the right path wasn't a military strategy or a diplomatic negotiation. It was a door, the door of the temple. That's the first side of the contrast. Sennacherib had everything: army, money, power, conquered territories, troop morale through the roof. Hezekiah had nothing. He'd already emptied his coffers. He'd already handed over the temple gold. He'd already admitted his defeat. His army was insignificant compared to the Assyrians. And to make things worse, what came next was an attack that didn't use swords or arrows. It was an attack with words. But there's something you need to understand about Assyrian psychological warfare to grasp what Hezekiah faced. And this is crucial for understanding why his prayer was so extraordinary. Sennacherib sent 3 of his most important officers to the walls of Jerusalem: Tartan, Rabsaris, and Rabshakeh. The last one was the official spokesman, the specialist in psychological warfare. And what Rabshakeh did was a speech calculated with surgical precision. 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 19 through 25, records every word. "Tell Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria. What confidence is this in which you trust? You say you have strategy and power for war, but they are only empty words. In whom do you trust that you rebel against me?" Notice the structure of that argument. It wasn't shouting random threats. It was a speech designed to destroy the people's faith point by point. Rabshakeh started where it hurt most. Egypt. "You trust in Egypt," he said, "that broken reed of a staff which will pierce the hand of whoever leans on it." 2 Kings 18, verse 21. And the worst part is he was right. Egypt was a weak and inconsistent ally. Historically, every time someone trusted Egypt to rescue them from Assyria, Egypt failed. Rabshakeh was using a real fact to demoralize. But he didn't stop there. Because once the people began doubting their earthly ally, Rabshakeh aimed directly at their heavenly ally. He said, "If you say to me that you trust in the Lord your God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, telling Judah they must worship only before this altar in Jerusalem?" Verse 22. Think about how twisted that argument was. Hezekiah had removed the high places as an act of faithfulness to God, but Rabshakeh presented it as if Hezekiah had offended God by destroying his altars. For common people on the wall who perhaps didn't understand the difference between a legitimate altar and a pagan worship site, that could sound convincing. He'd already taken away their confidence in Egypt. Now he was taking away their confidence in God, and then he went after their military dignity. He offered a mocking deal. "Make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria, and I'll give you 2,000 horses if you're able to put riders on them." Verse 23. It was a public humiliation. He was saying Judah was so weak it couldn't even fill 2,000 borrowed horses. And he was probably right. After Hezekiah surrendered the temple treasury to pay the tribute, his military resources must have been at their lowest point. If that left you speechless, watch what follows, because the worst hadn't arrived yet. Rabshakeh said, "Do you think I have come up against this place to destroy it without the Lord? The Lord himself said to me, 'Go up against this land and destroy it.'" Verse 25. He was saying God himself had sent the Assyrians against Jerusalem. It was a lie. But imagine how that sounded in the ears of a people who had just watched 46 cities fall, a people who had seen the northern kingdom disappear, a people who perhaps wondered if God was really protecting them. Rabshakeh had been dismantling every source of hope in order, first the earthly ally, then the relationship with God, then the military capacity, and finally God's own will. It was total psychological demolition. And then something revealing happened. Hezekiah's counselors, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah, asked Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic, the diplomatic language, and not in Hebrew, so the people on the wall wouldn't understand. 2 Kings 18, verse 26. They were terrified. They didn't want the people to hear those arguments, but Rabshakeh did exactly the opposite. He turned toward the wall and shouted even louder in Hebrew, "Don't listen to Hezekiah. Make peace with me. Surrender. And each of you will eat from his own vine and his own fig tree and drink water from his own well." 2 Kings 18, verses 31 and 32. He offered them peace, prosperity, food, water, everything a besieged people needs to hear. And then he finished with something that sought to destroy the only thing they had left: hope in God. He asked, "Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Did they deliver Samaria from my hand?" Verses 33 through 35. The argument was crushing from human logic. No god had stopped Assyria, not the gods of Hamath, not those of Arpad. not those of Samaria. Why would it be different with the God of Judah? And the people did something I find extraordinary. They remained silent. They answered him not a word, for the king had commanded, "Do not answer him." Verse 36. In the middle of the most demoralizing speech you can imagine, the people obeyed their king. They didn't argue. They didn't shout. They didn't negotiate. Silence. That silence was an act of faith in itself. Now hold on a moment. This was Sennacherib's arsenal, an army of 185,000 soldiers, 46 cities already taken, the temple gold in his coffers, a psychological speech designed to destroy the people's faith, and a track record of victories against every nation he'd faced. All of that against a king with no army, no treasury, no allies. The only thing he had left was the temple door. If you feel something at this point in the story, it's because you understand what it means to be out of options. And this is exactly where you enter this story, because what Hezekiah did next is something any person can do when they have nothing left. Hezekiah's counselors arrived at the palace with their clothes torn. That was the universal sign of anguish in the ancient world. They told the king everything Rabshakeh had said, and the first thing Hezekiah did was exactly the same. He tore his clothes, he covered himself with sackcloth, and he entered the house of the Lord. 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 1. He didn't go to the throne room to plan a military strategy. He didn't summon his generals. He didn't send messengers to Egypt. He went to the temple. That decision, which seems simple, was actually the most strategic decision of the entire crisis. Because Hezekiah understood something Sennacherib could never understand, that the battle wasn't between Judah and Assyria. It was between the God of Israel and human arrogance. And there's a pattern in Hezekiah's life worth noting. Every time he faced a crisis, his first instinct was to go to the temple. When he heard the blasphemies of Rabshakeh, he tore his clothes and entered the house of the Lord. When he received Sennacherib's letter, he spread it before the Lord. Later in his life, when the prophet Isaiah told him he would die from his illness, 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 2 says he turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord. He was a man whose instinctive reflex in the face of danger was not to fight or flee, but to pray. That's not weakness. That's the most radical form of strength that exists, because it requires admitting you can't resolve the situation alone. And for a king, a man accustomed to giving orders and receiving obedience, that admission costs more than we can imagine. Sennacherib would never have knelt before anyone. That was precisely his problem. At the same time, he sent his men covered in sackcloth to the prophet Isaiah with a message that reveals his mental state. 2 Kings 19 verses 3 and 4. Thus says Hezekiah, "This is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the point of birth, but there is no strength to bring them forth. Perhaps the Lord your God will hear all the words of Rabshakeh, whom his master the king of Assyria sent to insult the living God, and will rebuke the words which the Lord your God has heard. Therefore, lift up a prayer for the remnant that is left." That metaphor of a woman in labor without strength to deliver is heartbreaking. Hezekiah was saying, we're at the most critical moment, and we don't have the capacity to get out of this on our own. We need intervention. Isaiah's response was immediate and direct. 2 Kings 19, verses 6 and 7. Thus says the Lord, "Do not be afraid of the words you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. I will put a spirit in him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." Two things here. First, God didn't say, "Don't fear the Assyrian army." He said, "Don't fear the words." God was identifying exactly what Sennacherib's main weapon was. It wasn't the swords. It was the words, the psychological warfare, the blasphemy, and God would respond to that with his own words. Second, notice the prophecy. He shall hear a rumor. He shall return to his land. He shall fall by the sword in his own land. 3 concrete, verifiable predictions. It wasn't a vague promise of everything's going to be okay. It was a specific plan with 3 events that could be confirmed or denied. But the story didn't end there, because Sennacherib sent a letter, 2 Kings 19 verses 10 through 13, and this letter was essentially a written, more condensed version of Rabshakeh's speech. Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying, Jerusalem shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. You have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, destroying them utterly, and shall you be delivered? Did the gods of the nations which my fathers destroyed deliver them? Now, to understand what happens next, you need to know something about the function of letters in the ancient world. A royal letter was a document with legal authority. It bore the king's seal. It represented the monarch's will. Sending a letter with threats was a formal diplomatic act, a written declaration of war. It wasn't a casual insult, it was an official sentence. And what Hezekiah did with that letter changed history. Verse 14. Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. Then he went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. Did you catch that? He didn't crumple it. He didn't burn it. He didn't hide it. He took it, went up to the temple, and literally unfolded it before God, as if he was saying, look at this, read this. This is what they're saying about you. It was an act of impressive spiritual audacity. He placed Sennacherib's threat directly before the throne of God and basically said, this is between you and him. There's something profoundly practical in what Hezekiah did that we sometimes overlook. He didn't pray in the abstract. He didn't simply say, Lord, I have a problem. He brought the problem physically. He placed it before God in concrete form. The letter, the parchment with Sennacherib's blasphemous words, was there, spread out on the temple floor. It was as if Hezekiah turned his enemy's threat into the evidence he was presenting before the supreme judge of the universe. And that teaches us something about prayer that few people practice. Being specific, no vagueness, no generalities, but bringing the concrete problem with a name and a face and placing it before God. Hezekiah didn't pray, help me with my enemies. He prayed, showing exactly what the enemy was saying, what he intended to do, and why that was a direct insult to the character of God. And then he prayed, and this prayer is what I want us to analyze word by word, because each phrase was a strategic piece of what I like to call the architecture of the most lethal prayer in history. 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 15 through 19. Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O Lord, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You made the heavens and the earth. First line, notice what he's doing. He didn't start by asking, he started by declaring who God was, enthroned above the cherubim. That phrase wasn't a poetic ornament. The cherubim were above the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place. It was a direct reference to God's throne in the midst of his people. Hezekiah was saying, you are here, you are seated on your throne in this temple. You are present. Then, you alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. That was the direct response to Rabshakeh. Rabshakeh had said, no God saved their nation from us. Hezekiah responded, those weren't gods. You are the only God of all the kingdoms, not just Judah, all of them, including Assyria. And then you made the heavens and the earth. That was the theological foundation of everything. If you created everything, then everything belongs to you. Sennacherib doesn't control anything. You haven't allowed him to control. His army exists because you permit it to exist. His victories occurred because you decided so. But there's something else here most people overlook. There's a Hebrew word that is fundamental. When Hezekiah says you alone, the word is ata levadeka. That emphatic construction, you alone, you only, appears in contexts where everyone else is being excluded. It wasn't simply a compliment. It was a declaration of theological war against every false god Assyria claimed as the source of its power. What I'm about to tell you might make you uncomfortable, but Hezekiah's prayer was constructed like a legal argument, and the next line proves it. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. Hear the words Sennacherib has sent to insult the living God. Verse 16. Incline your ear. Open your eyes. Those aren't casual expressions. They are formal petition formulas that appear in the Psalms and in Israel's formal prayers. But the crucial part is the last section. The words Sennacherib has sent to insult the living God. Hezekiah didn't say to insult us. He said to insult you. He completely shifted the focus. The offense wasn't against Judah, it was against God. And by doing that, he transformed the situation from a political military problem to a matter of divine honor. He was saying, this man didn't challenge me, he challenged you. And if you don't respond, he's going to be right. All the nations are going to believe you're just like the false gods that couldn't save anyone. If you needed to pause for a second there, it's because you're understanding the magnitude of what Hezekiah did. He made God a stakeholder in the conflict, not as a favor God was doing for him, but as something God had to do for his own name. Verses 17 and 18. Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have devastated the nations and their lands and have cast their gods into the fire. But they were not gods, but the work of human hands, wood and stone. Therefore, they could destroy them. This is brilliant. Hezekiah conceded Rabshakeh's point. Yes, Assyria destroyed all those nations. Yes, no God saved them. But not because Assyria was invincible. Because those gods were made of wood and stone. They weren't gods. They were human craftsmanship. Notice the logic. Hezekiah didn't deny the facts. He reinterpreted them. Sennacherib saw his victories as evidence of his power. Hezekiah saw them as evidence that the other gods were false. The same evidence, two opposite conclusions. And Hezekiah's conclusion had a devastating implication. The God of Israel is not like them. And now we arrive at verse 19. The petition, the moment of truth. Now therefore, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, O Lord, are God. That's the entire petition. One sentence. After all the theological argumentation, after establishing who God is, after redefining the Assyrian victories, after turning the situation into a matter of divine honor, the petition was a single line. Save us. And the reason, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God. Hezekiah didn't ask for salvation to be comfortable. He didn't ask for victory to boast. He asked God to act so his name would be known throughout all the earth. The motivation of the prayer was not the survival of Judah, it was the glory of God. And that, according to everything the Bible teaches about how God responds to prayers, is what made this prayer irresistible to God. And notice something few people catch. Compare Hezekiah's prayer with the prayer Solomon prayed when he dedicated the temple centuries earlier. 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 41 through 43. Solomon asked that when the foreigner came from a distant land to pray in that temple, God would hear him so that all peoples of the earth may know your name. It's the same petition, the same motivation. Hezekiah was praying in the tradition of Solomon, in the temple Solomon built, using the same theological logic Solomon had established, that God's action on behalf of Israel has a global purpose. It's not just for Israel, It's so all nations may know the true God. There's one more connection most people miss. In Moses' prayer, in Numbers chapter 14, verses 13 through 16, when God wanted to destroy Israel after the rebellion of the spies, Moses used exactly the same argument. If you destroy them, the nations will say you weren't able to bring them to the land you promised. Moses appealed to God's name, and God changed his mind. Hezekiah appealed to God's name, and God sent his angel. It's the same principle operating across centuries. When your prayer aligns with what God wants for his own name, it becomes a weapon no army can stop. Now stop for a second and think about the contrast. On one side, Sennacherib had an army of 185,000 soldiers, 46 conquered cities, 300 talents of silver and 30 of gold extorted, a propaganda machine led by Rabshakeh, an official letter of threat, centuries of military victories, and absolute confidence that no force on earth could stop him. On the other side, Hezekiah had a 5-verse prayer: no army, no gold, no allies, just words directed at heaven from a temple whose golden doors had been ripped off. But those 5 lines did something 185,000 swords could not. They moved the hand of God. Now let's shift perspective for a moment. Everything we've seen so far was from Hezekiah's side: the fear, the desperation, the prayer. But imagine this from God's side. An arrogant king has just sent a letter saying the God of Israel is just as powerless as the wooden gods Assyria burned. And a man has just spread that letter on the floor of the temple and said, "Defend your name." How does God respond to that? The response came through Isaiah, and it was extensive. 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 20 through 34. Isaiah sent a message to Hezekiah saying, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I have heard your prayer concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria." And what follows is one of the most poetically demolishing responses God gives in the entire Bible. "The virgin daughter of Zion despises you and mocks you. The daughter of Jerusalem shakes her head as you flee." Verse 21. God didn't respond with diplomacy. He responded with mockery. The image is devastating. Jerusalem, the city Sennacherib thought he'd conquer, laughs at him as he flees. And God asks Sennacherib directly, "Whom have you insulted and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in arrogance?" Against the Holy One of Israel. Verse 22. The Holy One of Israel. That title appears 26 times in Isaiah. It's a title that emphasizes the absolute separation between God and everything else. Holy means set apart, different, in an entirely different category. Sennacherib had treated the God of Israel as if he were just another local god on the list he could defeat. God reminded him he was in a completely different league. But what comes next is the twist that changes the reading of the entire story. Verses 25 and 26, "Have you not heard that long ago I determined it? From ancient times I planned it, and now I have brought it to pass, that you should turn fortified cities into heaps of ruins." Did you hear that? God told Sennacherib that all his victories, every city he conquered, every nation he crushed, were not his achievements. They were God's plan being executed through him. Sennacherib was an instrument, nothing more. He thought he was the player, but he was the piece. He believed he was directing history, but God told him history was directing him. This connects with a deep theme in Isaiah. In chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, God calls Assyria the rod of my anger and the staff of my indignation. Against an ungodly nation I will send him. Assyria was not an independent power. It was a disciplinary instrument God used against sinful nations. The problem was that the rod thought itself more important than the hand wielding it. Isaiah 10 verse 15 says it bluntly, "Shall the axe boast itself against him who chops with it? Shall the saw exalt itself against him who saws with it?" Sennacherib was an axe that thought it was the lumberjack. And that should make us reflect on something uncomfortable. How many times do we assume our achievements are exclusively ours? How many times does success convince us we're invincible? Sennacherib's story is a brutal reminder that power without humility is a road that always ends in ruin. It doesn't matter how many cities you conquer. It doesn't matter how many armies you defeat. If your power makes you believe you don't need anyone, not even God, you're building on sand. And that contrast between Sennacherib and Hezekiah resurfaces powerfully here. Sennacherib boasted of his conquests as if they were his own. Hezekiah recognized that even the salvation he was asking for wasn't for himself, but for God's glory. One inflated himself, the other emptied himself. And in the end, the one who emptied himself was filled, and the one who inflated himself was deflated in a single night. Hit like on this video if you're understanding the magnitude of what's happening here, because every detail of this story takes on new meaning when you look at it from this perspective. God's sentence continued. Verse 27. I know you're sitting down, you're going out, and you're coming in, and your rage against me. God knew everything, every movement of Sennacherib, every thought, every plan, every blasphemy. Nothing was hidden. And then the final sentence, verse 28. Because your rage against me and your tumult have come up to my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips, and I will make you return by the way you came. Hook in the nose, bridle in the lips. That imagery wasn't accidental. The Assyrians were known for putting literal hooks in the noses of their captives and dragging them along. It appears in Assyrian reliefs found in Nineveh. God used the same image the Assyrians applied to their victims and applied it to Sennacherib. What you do to others, I will do to you. But before the judgment fell, God gave Hezekiah a sign of hope for the future. Verses 29 through 31, This shall be a sign to you, Hezekiah. This year you shall eat what grows of itself, and in the second year what springs from the same. But in the third year sow and reap, plant vineyards and eat their fruit. The surviving remnant of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem shall go a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. The sign was agricultural. Due to the siege and devastation, the people hadn't been able to sow. So God promised them that for 2 years they would eat what the land produced spontaneously, and by the third year they could resume their normal agricultural life. It was a practical promise for people with real hunger. But notice the metaphor. They shall take root downward and bear fruit upward. Judah wouldn't just survive. It would grow. It would expand. It would produce. The crisis that seemed like the end would become the starting point of a new chapter. And then God pronounced the definitive sentence over Jerusalem. Verses 32 through 34. Therefore thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city. He shall not shoot an arrow there. He shall not come before it with a shield. He shall not build a siege mound against it. By the way he came, by it he shall return, and he shall not come into this city, says the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David. He shall not come in, he shall not shoot an arrow, he shall not raise a shield, he shall not build a siege ramp, nothing. Zero military action against Jerusalem, and the reasons, for my own sake, for my own honor, and for the promise I made to David. 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 16, where God promised David that his throne would endure forever. A promise that would find its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ, a descendant of David according to the flesh, as Paul confirms in Romans chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Hezekiah's prayer had appealed to exactly the two things that motivated God, his name and his covenant, and that's why it was answered. And now we arrive at that night, 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 35, one of the most impactful verses in the entire Bible. And it came to pass on that very night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. When the men arose early in the morning, there they were, all dead, one night, one angel, 185,000 soldiers, dead. The Hebrew text uses the expression Malach Yahweh, the angel of the Lord. This expression appears throughout the Old Testament at moments of direct intervention. It's the same type of agent who appeared to Hagar in the desert in Genesis chapter 16, the same who stayed Abraham's hand over Isaac in Genesis chapter 22, the same who stood with a drawn sword before Balaam in Numbers chapter 22. This was no ordinary angel. It was the personal executor of the divine will at the most decisive moments in history. And a single angel was sufficient, not a heavenly army, not a legion. One against 185,000. That gives a measure of the power we're discussing here. David had sung it in Psalm 34 verse 7. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. That night, that psalm stopped being poetry and became military reality. The Bible gives no details about how they died. It describes no battle. It describes no resistance. It describes no wounds, only death. Silent, total, instantaneous. The most powerful army of the ancient world, neutralized in a single night by a single celestial agent. To put it in perspective, 185,000 soldiers is more than the entire combined force many famous ancient battles assembled. The Battle of Gaugamela, where Alexander the Great defeated Darius III, involved approximately 47,000 Greek soldiers against a larger number of Persians. The Battle of Cannae, Rome's greatest defeat, involved approximately 86,000 Roman soldiers. 185,000 was an astronomical number. Now imagine the scene from the perspective of the Assyrians who survived. Verse 36. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed, went home and lived in Nineveh. That sentence is almost comical in its brevity. The man who had sent epic speeches, threatening letters, intimidating delegations, simply departed. He went home. Rabshakeh's arrogance, Sennacherib's boasts, the conquest plans, all of it evaporated in one night. And the Taylor Prism, that Assyrian inscription we mentioned at the beginning, is revealing in what it doesn't say. It describes the campaign against Judah in detail. It mentions the tribute Hezekiah paid. It boasts of having shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage. But it says not one word about having conquered Jerusalem, because he didn't conquer it. And it doesn't mention the loss of 185,000 soldiers, because no king boasts of the worst military catastrophe of his reign. Interestingly, even non-biblical sources recorded something unusual about this campaign. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing some 200 years after the events in his histories, Book 2, Chapter 141, mentions a tradition that attributed the defeat of the Assyrian army on the Egyptian border to a plague of mice that destroyed their weapons during the night. Although the details differ from the biblical account, the coincidence that multiple ancient traditions remember a sudden, nocturnal defeat of Sennacherib's army is significant. Something catastrophic happened to that army. The sources agree on that, even if they differ on the explanation. Some modern scholars have proposed the destruction may have been a sudden epidemic, perhaps bubonic plague transmitted by rats, which would explain both Herodotus's account of the mice and the mass death in one night. But for the Bible, the agent is clear, the angel of the Lord. And whatever physical mechanism God may have used, the biblical text leaves no doubt it was a direct intervention in response to Hezekiah's prayer. And there's another detail that goes unnoticed. 2 Kings 19 verse 35 says that when the men arose early the next morning, They were all dead. Who arose? The survivors. Perhaps lower-ranking officers, servants, or soldiers on the periphery of the camp. Sennacherib himself survived. The death wasn't indiscriminate, it was directed, and that's consistent with the idea of an intelligent agent executing a specific judgment, not a random natural catastrophe. But Isaiah's prophecy wasn't finished. God had said three things. He shall hear a rumor, he shall return to his land, and he shall fall by the sword in his own land. The first two were fulfilled immediately. The third took a little longer, but was fulfilled with blood-chilling precision. Verse 37, while he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch, his god, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer struck him down with the sword, and they escaped to the land of Ararat. Then Esarhaddon his son reigned in his place. Sennacherib was murdered by his own sons in the temple of his own god while worshipping. The irony is crushing. The man who had mocked the God of Israel, saying no, God could save anyone from his hands, was murdered in the house of his own God, which couldn't save him. Assyrian records, including the Babylonian Chronicle, confirm that Sennacherib was murdered by one or more of his sons around the year 681 BC. Approximately 20 years after the campaign against Jerusalem. 20 years. God was in no hurry. Isaiah's prophecy didn't say when he would die. It said he would die by the sword in his own land. And so he did. And think about those 20 years. Every night Sennacherib lay down in his palace in Nineveh. The prophecy was still pending. Every time he entered the temple of Nisroch, he was one step closer to fulfillment. He didn't know when it would come, but the word of God spoken through Isaiah was in motion, unstoppable, inevitable. Rabshakeh had asked, has any God delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? The final answer was, yes. The God of Israel did. And the God of Assyria couldn't even protect his most powerful devotee inside his own temple. And this is what you need to understand as the revelation that changes the entire reading of this story. What happened that night was not simply an act of divine military power. It wasn't God showing he could kill more people than Sennacherib. It was the demonstration of a principle that runs through the entire Bible from beginning to end. God's weapons and man's weapons operate in completely different dimensions. Sennacherib used soldiers, swords, battering rams, propaganda, letters, intimidation, money, alliances, logistics, military experience. And all of that couldn't do what a 5-verse prayer accomplished. Because Hezekiah's prayer wasn't a magic formula, it wasn't a secret word. It was the total surrender of a man who understood he couldn't save himself and that God's honor was at stake. Every line of that prayer demonstrated deep theological understanding. He knew who God was. He knew what motivated God. He knew how to present the situation in a way that gave God a reason to act that was bigger than Judah's own survival. And that's why it worked. Not because Hezekiah was especially eloquent, but because his prayer was aligned with God's purposes. He asked for what God already wanted to do. And that's what an effective prayer always is, not convincing God to do something he doesn't want to do, but aligning yourself with what he's already doing. Think about it in your own life. How many times do you face situations where your human resources run out, where the other side's argument seems invincible, where the statistics say you have no chance, where logic says you lose, where someone who seems stronger, more prepared, more equipped, is about to roll over you, and in that moment the only thing you have left is a prayer. I know people who have been in their own Jerusalem, surrounded, without resources, with the voices of their own Rabshakehs screaming at them to surrender, a medical diagnosis that says there's no way out, a financial situation that has no logical solution, a relationship that seems unrecoverable, a legal problem that crushes them. And in that moment of absolute desperation, when every human plan has failed, When they've already handed over the gold from their own temple doors, trying to buy a way out, they reach the point where the only thing left is to kneel. And the lesson of Hezekiah is not that God is always going to send an angel to kill your enemies. The Bible doesn't promise that. There are prophets who died, martyrs who suffered, faithful people who didn't receive the deliverance they hoped for in this life. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 35 through 38 makes that clear. But what the story of Hezekiah does teach is that God listens, that when a prayer is built on the right foundations, when it appeals to God's name and not just our comfort, when it recognizes who He really is and not who we want Him to be, that prayer has a power no human force can match. What Hezekiah teaches us is not that prayer is an emergency resource when everything else fails. It's that prayer is the primary resource that should have been there from the beginning. The difference between the Hezekiah who paid 300 talents of silver and the Hezekiah who spread the letter in the temple is the difference between trying to resolve things with human resources and surrendering completely to God. Both actions were done by the same man, but only one of them moved the hand of God. If this touched something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this, someone who's in their own siege of Jerusalem, someone who believes they have no options left. 2 Chronicles chapter 32 verses 7 and 8 records something that doesn't appear in Kings. Words Hezekiah said to his people before the crisis: "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or dismayed before the king of Assyria or the multitude that is with him. For there are more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles." And the people rested on the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. With him is an arm of flesh. With us is the Lord. That was the equation. 185,000 soldiers of flesh against a God who made the heavens and the earth. From heaven's perspective, there was never a contest. And the expression arm of flesh is not casual. In Hebrew, basar means flesh in the sense of what is temporary, weak, mortal. Jeremiah chapter 17 verse 5 says, "Cursed is the man who trusts in man, who makes flesh his arm, and whose heart departs from the Lord." The arm of flesh is every human resource we place above God: money, influence, connections, strategy, talent. It's not that those things are bad in themselves. It's that when they become your primary source of security, they become your personal Sennacherib. They seem invincible until God blows. Sennacherib never understood who he was fighting against. He thought he was fighting a small king of a small kingdom with a small local god. He had no idea he was challenging the creator of the universe. And when the angel descended that night, it wasn't because God was furious and lost control. It was because a man prayed, and his prayer activated something that had been prepared since before the foundation of the world. The prophet Isaiah would later record it in his chapter 37, verses 33 through 35, preserving the same account with slight variations that confirm it is an event recorded by multiple sources within Scripture itself. And 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verses 20 and 21 offers a third account. King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah the son of Amoz cried out to heaven about this, and the Lord sent an angel who destroyed every mighty warrior, commander, and officer in the camp of the king of Assyria. 3 books, 3 records, 1 event, 1 prayer, 1 angel, 185,000 dead. And that convergence of testimonies is more significant than it appears. 2 Kings was likely compiled during the exile in Babylon, a century and a half after the events. 2 Chronicles was written after the return from exile, even later, and Isaiah was a contemporary of the events. 3 different perspectives, 3 different moments of writing, 3 different audiences, and all 3 agree on the essentials. Hezekiah prayed. God responded, and 185,000 soldiers died in one night. The fact that the chronicler in 2 Chronicles chapter 32 verse 20 adds that both Hezekiah and Isaiah cried out to heaven together is a detail only Chronicles mentions. The king and the prophet praying together, political power and spiritual power united in the same direction, not competing for influence, but aligned in a single purpose. When a political leader and a spiritual leader genuinely agree in seeking God's will, the result can be transformative. And a lesson that has resonated for 2,700 years: don't underestimate what one person on their knees can do when their prayer is aligned with the purposes of heaven. Because that night, the distance between total defeat and absolute victory was not an army, not an alliance, not a military strategy. It was a 5-verse prayer uttered by a man who had nothing left to offer except his faith in a God who turned out to be more than enough.